Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about the reality of shooting with a high megapixel camera, such as the Sony A7R IV. And I'm going to start right now. Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. My name is James, and if it is the very first time to this channel and you want to learn all about Photoshop, Lightroom and everything photography related, start now by subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss anything. So in this video guys, we're going to be talking about shooting with a high megapixel camera and the reality of shooting with one day to day. Now in this example, I'm going to be using the Sony A7R IV, but again, I've done a real world review of this camera, so if you're more interested in the other features that this camera offers, make sure to go and have a look at that, and I'll put the link in the description. But today we're just going to be talking about the high resolution aspect of this camera and what it is like shooting versus a lower megapixel camera such as the A7 III. So without further ado guys, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is the actual file sizes of each of these two cameras. Now in comparison today, I'm going to be using a low megapixel camera such as my Canon 60 Mark II, which shoots 26 megapixels, versus the Sony A7R IV, which shoots 61 megapixels. And in fact, this is the highest megapixel full frame camera on the market today. So this is going to be a great comparison to see how much larger the files are on this Sony. So as you can see on the graph here, we've got two different options. We've got compressed and uncompressed RAW. Now again, there is always JPEG available. If you are shooting, especially with a high megapixel camera, I would highly recommend shooting RAW because you've got more information based within the camera that allows you to bring back the highlights and bring back the shadows without necessarily affecting the quality of the photo. So as you can see here, we've got uncompressed and compressed RAW compared with the Canon 60 Mark II, which shoots uncompressed RAW between 20 to 30 megabytes. You can see there is a massive jump up with the Sony, and it's almost 5 times larger, over 120 megabytes. Now this is going to affect your photography in 3 different aspects. First thing you want to take into consideration is you're going to need larger SD cards. Now with an SD card in my Canon 60 Mark II, I shoot 64 gigabytes, and that takes around about 1500 photos per SD card. But with the Sony, you're going to be shooting between 4 to 5 times less photos per 64 gigs. So I would recommend either shooting 64 gig or above. The highest one I think, which is reasonable price, is the 256 gig SanDisk card. But again, there are other options available. So that is something that you're going to have to take into consideration. SD cards are a lot more expensive, especially when you go for larger gigabyte size. So if you are shooting, especially uncompressed RAW, you do need to buy larger SD cards. Another thing to take into consideration is the actual file sizes on your computer. You're going to need either a very, very large hard drive or external hard drive to save all of your files. Now obviously you can always shoot redundant, which means you can save the JPEGs and just use the RAW ones that you're after. But if you are wanting to save all of your uncompressed RAW files onto some kind of hard drive, the hard drive is going to be quite large. Again, I always choose between 1 to 4 terabytes, but if you are shooting with the Sony, you're either going to have to buy more of them or buy larger ones, which is going to cost you a lot more money. Another thing to take into consideration is the actual processing power of each of the photos. So you're going to need quite a new computer to actually render or actually use any of the photos. So I use an iMac, and again, all of these comparisons are going to be between the Canon and the Sony, and I found this takes between 4 to 8 times slower than the Canon, especially when I'm opening up either in Photoshop, Preview, or especially when I use Lightroom. So if you are doing shots with clients, you do need to take the time or to simply open the files into consideration, especially when you're using the Sony. So that's going to take you longer, especially for post-processing. So you make sure to add that to your budget if you are shooting with a high megapixel camera such as this Sony. Now another thing to take into consideration is the ISO range of both low megapixels and high megapixels, such as this Sony A7R IV. Now the megapixels of both of the Canon 60 Mark II and the Sony are very similar. They both shoot to around 40,000 ISO. But with the shots that I took, I found the ISO was a lot more noticeable on the Sony. And this is just down to having there's just literally more pixels in the photo. Now, I found shooting at 100, 1000, 6400, 12,800, 40,000 and 102,000, I found roughly all of them were very similar. But if you compare them side by side, you can really see that the ISO grain, especially in the shadows, is a lot worse on the Sony. And this is just down to simply more megapixels mean there's going to be more grain. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the grain is larger or there's a lot more of it. It just means it's more noticeable because you can zoom in further. So that is something that you're going to take into consideration. Now, this really does show on the Canon lineup. So if we compare the Canon EOS R5 versus the EOS R6, the ISO range is almost double on the EOS R6, and that's because it's got almost half the megapixels. So on the Canon EOS R5, it's around 45 megapixels, where it's only 20 megapixels on the R6. Now, again, this is just due to the sensors, but it doesn't mean the sensor is worse on the R5. It just means that it's less sensitive to ISO grain using the R6, and this is because of the lower megapixel count. So if you are someone that shoots a lot in low light, or if you are someone that wants less ISO grain, especially less noticeable ISO grain, you're going to have to shoot less on a higher megapixel camera versus a lower megapixel camera, even though they are both full frame. So do take that into consideration, especially in post-processing. Removing grain is a lot more difficult on a higher resolution camera or a higher resolution photo. So the next thing I'm going to be talking about is the actual lenses for high megapixel cameras. Now, again, the lenses, the optical performance isn't going to change either on a full frame low megapixel versus a full frame high megapixel. Because there's more megapixels on a higher megapixel camera, the defects of the particular lenses are going to be more noticeable. So things such as vignetting, chromatic aberration and distortion are going to be more difficult to remove on a high megapixel camera. So let's say we have chromatic aberration on a 60 Mark II. Let's say the chromatic aberration is between 3 to 6 pixels thick. So that's chromatic aberration is where color fringing appears on high contrast edges. Now, it's going to be fairly easy to remove because there's only 6 pixels to take into consideration when you are trying to remove it. But let's say we double the megapixels to 61 megapixels. That 6 pixels thick chromatic aberration is going to turn into 12 pixels. So that's going to be more difficult to remove, especially on a higher megapixel camera, such as this Sony, or anything above around 40 megapixels. So do take that into consideration. You're going to have to buy like the best of the best lenses with a higher megapixel camera, which means you're going to spend more money on the lenses as well as the camera body. Now, obviously the defects aren't necessarily going to change because the optical performance of the lens doesn't change doesn't matter what camera you put it on. They're just going to be more noticeable. So chromatic aberration and especially distortion and vignetting are going to be a lot more difficult to remove using the higher megapixel camera because there's just simply more information in the photo. So last but most importantly, when it comes to deciding what camera is right for you, is the price. And I must say there is a big difference, especially when you compare a lower megapixel camera to a high megapixel camera. So instead of using the Canon as an example, because the Canon is a slightly older full frame camera, so the price is naturally going to be a bit lower, let's swap it out for one of the newer Sony cameras. Let's swap it out for the Sony A7 III, which is a 24 megapixel camera. So again, it's very similar to the Canon. So let's have a look at the price. So at the moment, the Sony A7 III comes in at £1,749, which compared to this particular camera here is great value for money, and it's one of my favourite cameras out today. But let's compare the price to the Sony A7R IV. The Sony A7R IV comes in at £3,499, almost double the price. And that is because obviously it's a newer camera with more features, but you've got to work out what feature is right for you. Now, 24 megapixels, I would say, is perfect for almost all types of photography. And you're only certain types of photography you're going to need a very high megapixel camera, such as maybe if you're doing studios, or maybe if you need a very large megapixels because you want to print canvases very, very large, maybe say you're a landscape artist. So you've really got to have a look at, is the price point of the Sony worth it compared to the lower megapixel equivalent? Now obviously there is more difference between these two cameras than just the megapixels. I do talk about that in my real world review, but because obviously the high megapixel count of this camera, and it's kind of like a world first, it being about 61 megapixels, like I was saying, the highest megapixel camera of all full frame cameras today. The only few cameras that beat this are the medium format ones, which are a lot more money. Really, the difference between these two cameras is the megapixels. Obviously I know there are a few different variants of them, but that's really the crux of the matter. And you've really got to work out if the high megapixel count is worth it, especially with the high ISO grain and also the price point. But you've also got to include the lenses that you've got. You've got to make sure that they're very low distortion lenses, especially when it comes to chromatic aberration, distortion and vignetting. But you've also got to take into consideration the actual file format. Again, uncompressed RAW is almost 5 times larger than shooting with my Canon 6D. So taking all that into consideration, you've really got to think if this particular camera is worth it. Brilliant, and there we go guys. So there is my comparison between a low megapixel and a high megapixel camera, and the reality of shooting with a high megapixel camera day to day. So there are the few things I would take into consideration if you are thinking of purchasing a high megapixel camera. Remember, larger file formats, more noticeable ISO grain. You need to make sure you buy good lenses because obviously the chromatic aberration, distortion and vignetting are going to be more noticeable on a high megapixel camera, but most importantly, the price is a lot more extreme, especially with the new Sony A7R IV. Again guys, if you want to like, comment and subscribe to my channel, it really does help my channel grow. Also, if you want to hit the bell notification so you don't miss any of my latest content. But until next time guys, keep creating.